Hi everyone, it's Toby and welcome to my channel. Thank you for joining me today where we are going to be exploring and reviewing in depth this budget art set by Meeden. So in this set we have brushes, 24 paints, many of them single pigment, a cotton pad of paper and a whole lot more. On the face of it that all looks very good, but it's also very cheap. So what are the drawbacks? There must be drawbacks for it to be able to be this cheap and also appear this good. And actually, I was pretty surprised. So as you watch this video, hopefully you'll get the feeling of just how surprised I was by some of the things which go on when we use this set. Don't forget, this is a paid promotion, so as with any paid promotion, make your own judgments, do your own research, and take everything I say with a little pinch of salt to make sure that you're making the right decision for yourself if you do choose to buy these products. When we're reviewing these things, it's good to know a little bit about the company, a little bit about the products themselves. So Meeden are a Chinese company, they manufacture in China and they export essentially worldwide. Now, for some people, this is a problem. For me, even I do much prefer to buy locally. The reason I still agreed to promote this product is because I'm aware that not everyone can afford to buy locally. Now, the other thing about them being budget is it's also not fair to compare them to, say, the most premium professional brand watercolours. Don't go replacing that with these. What we're looking at today is this set worth getting if you are just getting into your watercolours? If you want to fill a palette to explore the kind of colours you enjoy, does this work for you? The first thing to have a quick look inside are the watercolour paints. So we've got 24 colours and let's see what we've got. And the first thing I noticed when I open these up is that we've got a huge range of colours, but B, we actually have the pigment details on here. The transparency, which is this block at the right. So, for example, it's saying this yellow ochre, the titanium white, are fairly opaque, whereas these with a half block are saying they are fairly transparent, and this ultramarine blue, totally transparent. So we've got good information. In the middle, these three dots, that's saying totally or highly light fast. And it's actually really nice to see that almost all of these colours, if not all of these colours, are completely light fast. And that is something to look for in your colours when you're getting them, especially if you want to hang things on the wall. Now, when we then look at the pigments, let's have a look and just analyse a few of them. So we've got PW6, that is the normal pigment we use for titanium white. We've got PB29, so that's good, that's the normal pigment, the sort of authentic ultramarine blue pigment. PBK11, that's a very classic pigment we use in things like Mars Black. So what's great to see is that some of these pigments are what you'd call real or authentic. But what tends to happen when you have budget colours, so these are budget colours, make no mistake, that's what they're designed to be, is you'll find some of the more expensive pigments perhaps are not real. So when I say not real, I don't mean that they're fake, but I mean if we look up here, cobalt blue, true cobalt blue is very expensive. And what we actually have is we have PB29 ultramarine and PW6, which I happen to know is a phthalo blue. So this isn't really cobalt blue, this should say cobalt blue hue. Cobalt blue hue meaning it's not true cobalt blue, but it's a mix which is going to simulate that. We need to be aware that these things are not going to have the same effect in terms of perhaps you might not get the same granulation that you'd normally expect from cobalt blue. And I'm sure if we analysed all of these, we would find there are lots of hues, as well as some of the cheaper normal pigments being sort of the true pigment. So that is just something to be aware of when you buy cheaper paints. It's not necessarily a bad thing, in that the only way that they can be cheap is if they make these sort of alterations. But what we'll do, we'll move on, have a look at the other bits we got in this pack, and then of course we will get to actually testing these in practice and see what they do for us. Next, to have a really quick look, we have our paint palette and a water brush set. So I've unboxed the paint palette already. And what's really nice about this is that it's a good heavyweight bit of porcelain and ceramic paint palette. Now I don't often use palettes like this, I normally just use my travel palette, but ceramic is the best for watercolours. It's totally water impermeable. That means that it's easy to clean, it doesn't stain. So this is a really nice bit of kit actually for painting at home. And it's great to see this included because it's more expensive than including a lightweight plastic one for sure. But it does make a difference if you enjoy using one of these kind of cloverleaf style palettes at home. The brushes, we've got 10 brushes. Now these are of course synthetic brushes. Again, you wouldn't expect for a budget set to include real hair brushes, and personally I actually have a slight ethical preference in using synthetic hair brushes. A couple of my brushes that I use regularly aren't synthetic and I do really like them, but they were bought by accident, and if possible I try and find good quality synthetic brushes. I must say these are very pretty. I like the graduated blue. I don't know how long the graduated blue in these tips will last, because obviously you're going to put staining paints on them. But as a presentation, these are very lovely. Just because they're synthetic doesn't mean we need to judge them as inferior. So what we need to do is really have a go with them and see what their water carrying capacity is like, see what their pigment carrying capacity is like, and see how nice a point that they can hold as well. Next we have our paper. Now it's really nice to see this is 100% cotton. That is a marker of normally better quality papers, not always, but normally better quality papers. Good size, 10 by 7 inches, so this is somewhere between A5 and A4 for UK viewers, and actually a really nice size for sketching on. It's 300 grams per square metre, so that's a pretty standard thickness for paper, and it's a block which I do love. So you can see this green gum on all sides. It's got a sort of protective sheet on top, and what you'll need to do is get a knife or a palette knife underneath here, and you can slide it off, and like that you'll be able to get into your paper. And because it's gummed on all sides, I'd expect it to be quite good at holding its shape and not buckling, but we'll test that of course in the next few minutes. Lastly, and this isn't part of the set, but this is something I asked them to send me because I wanted to be able to fill up a nice palette with the new colours. We have a empty watercolour palette. This is the one thing I have used before from Meeden, and here it is, it's opened up, and I can say that actually this is a good quality palette. It's a metal tin palette, and I used a couple of Meeden palettes for years actually, because at that time I couldn't actually find anyone else selling them. You can find them from lots of other companies now, but you know, it's a quality metal palette. They don't need to be incredibly well made. It's got the standard mixing areas, so this is a good value bit of kit. That I can say, as long as it's similar to the construction I've had in the past, then it will last years if you want it to. What I'm going to do now is just fill this up with a few of the colours, and then we can get to testing and seeing what this sort of little set is really like. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pop them in my palette. As we do this, we can see what the consistency is like. We can really get a better idea of what the colours really look like. I want to say first impressions is really bright and bold, a really good range, well thought out set of colours. The consistency is very liquid. You can see as I pour them in, they really quickly settle and spread out. Now this could be really good. It'll certainly be very good if you like painting from that ceramic palette. Be interesting to see what happens when they dry out. Will they really easily sort of re-wet, or are these going to be tubes which are best painted from the ceramic palette? And I'll let you know in a couple of months when they're really dry. I'll do an update on this video. And now it's time to start selecting our brushes so that we can paint. Now as I was selecting my brushes, I noticed something really interesting. So these brushes don't have any sizes on, which is really odd because it's not a very challenging thing just to pop a size on. It doesn't bother me too much. This looks like a size 8 that I'm holding. But you know, for the smaller brushes and for if you lose one, it's quite nice to know exactly what size you've got. So not sure why they've not just popped a simple size on. I'm going to choose this one, what looks like a size 8. And then I'm going to choose one other brush. I'm going to choose a nice flat brush, probably this big one. It looks like about a 1/2 to 3/4 inch flat brush. And we will see how they work. And let's just do a little bit of a test to look at the flow we get from our colours and our brushes. Now, the way I'm first going to test is by doing a simple bit of swatching. The first thing I look for when I'm swatching is, do the colours in the palette match what it looks like on the paper? And I'm going to say, yeah, actually these colours in the palette are pretty true to what appears on the paper. The next thing we're sort of looking at is the intensity of the colour. And again, this is pretty good. These colours are really bright and bold. Now, one thing that we're going to test later is the opacity, how opaque these colours are. Because often the reason cheaper colours are bold is because they're not very translucent. They put brighteners in, they put white in. That helps make it bright without necessarily keeping the sort of integrity of translucent, transparent watercolours. We already know from the initial looking at them, of course, that most of the colours are either opaque or semi-opaque. So we'll see in a bit what that's like. Now, the last thing I'm trying to get an idea for with this quick swatching is what these brushes are like. And the first impressions is that the brushes are very flexible, very soft, and actually quite lovely to paint with. Again, we don't really know until we've done a little bit more of an exercise in this. We don't really know how good they are, but I was very prepared to come here and say cheap brushes are rubbish. And these actually, they feel quite nice. So it'll be interesting to see how they sketch. Overall, let's say these pigments are looking bright and bold. You can see as they're drying, they're not really fading. Again, that's good, but it might mean there's lots of opacity and brightens in there as well. Now, moving on, we're going to take that closer look. I've chosen 5 colours that I in theory know quite well. We've got lemon yellow, scarlet red, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna. And we're just going to use our ceramic palette to get to grips and have a little play. Using our flat brush, we can start to appreciate the flow of the colours and the brushes. And you can see that the flows are, not bad actually. So this brush is producing a nice graduated, rich flow of colour coming all the way down the page. The thing we want to do is start to appreciate how much pigment do we need to create that flow. So with the next blues, I actually try and use a little bit less pigment. And what you'll find is when we use a bit less pigment on this brush, well, the flow isn't quite as good. Now, this is something that probably represents the cheapness of the colours. With my normal colours, which are professional grade, and to be fair, the professional grade colours cost about the same for 2 tubes as this entire set, I would expect to be able to use a very small amount of pigment to get a really good flow. Here, we're getting a really bright colour, but look, as I re-wet that ultramarine, having to use rather a lot of colour. That said, the brush is doing a very good job. The brush is actually holding a lot of water and a lot of pigment, and the brush is producing a really lovely flow. So I'm very pleasantly surprised still by the quality of these brushes in their sort of painting experience. It is a very flexible brush though, it's very soft. So something I want to try out is how does it do drawing finer lines? And we can see, well, it is actually able to maintain quite a good line, but it's not really crisp. And that's because of just how flexible it is. On the other hand, the flexibility with the sort of round brushes does give us this ability to create nice watercolour shapes. And here we can see the round brush creates lovely sort of flow, just like the big brush, using lots of pigment, but still creates a lovely flow. Again, not a really fine point, not a really sharp point, but that's due to the flexibility. So overall, I'm pleasantly surprised. What we're going to do now is let them dry, and just like magic, we are dry. And this allows us to test a couple of things. Firstly, you can see the dry colours are still very bright. You could barely see the difference. So these colours don't lose much of their glow as they dry. Next, we can try and see a bit more about the opacity. And again, we know from looking at them that most of them are either opaque or semi-opaque. And this really comes through here. So with with sort of more expensive watercolours, you expect to be able to get this lovely glazing effect. Here it's a bit more like one colour covering another. Not ideal, but something just to be aware of. Lastly, I want to have a look at the textures and movement of these colours. So with lots of brighteners, which I think there's probably a lot of brighteners and white in these. Sometimes that means they're very flat, and often the expensive colours get a lot more granulation, a lot more natural texture. Actually here, what we are seeing is these colours move really well. I've wet the page with a spray bottle, and when I just drop the pigment in, when I move, simulating a wet and wet painting style, we actually get really lovely movement of these pigments all over, and they mix and blend with each other rather nicely on the page. We don't have much granulation at all. So this cobalt blue, which is the colour right in the middle, a true cobalt blue is a rather granulating colour. Here you can clearly see it's not granulating, but it is still moving. So this is a positive thing, the fact that we have movement, and this bodes well for my painting style, that I'll be able to produce some nice effects as I can blend and push these around. It's just a shame that there isn't nice granulation and other sort of natural watercolour textures going on. And with all of that, it is of course time just to sketch, and we can do a normal sketching process and see what happens. This gives us a lovely chance to test this paper with ink as well. So I've got my normal TWSBI Diamond 580 pen with my normal carbon black ink. And sometimes with cheap papers, they're very absorbent, and that makes your fountain pen sort of blot the page. Here, not so much. Again, pleasantly surprised at getting got a nice flow of ink, but not blotting, not creating unsightly or over thick lines. And so I can continue my lovely continuous line. Of course, this is my normal sketching process, just sketching simple shapes around the page. And we are getting a lovely flow. And this at the moment, it feels much nicer than sketching in, say, a cheap sketchbook, or even, actually, I've got to say, the flow is better than some good quality sketchbooks. And that comes down to the thickness of the paper, and it's got a nice cold press texture. You could tell that from the previous test as well, where we're testing flow and texture, that actually the paper texture is quite nice. As we move around, I guess just talk a little bit more about what I'm actually doing here, just finding really simple shapes. The size of the paper is 7 by 10 inches, which is a good size. It was my old favourite size. I've moved on to bigger sizes now, but it's what I first enjoyed sketching on. It's a little bit bigger than A5, a little bit smaller than A4, and a really lovely size to get loose and start learning and developing your style. So yeah, I think the test with ink has gone really well for this paper. It's not a hard test to pass, but it's a very important test to pass. And we can see that the quality of line that goes down this paper, there's a smooth ink flow. It's not over absorbent. So yeah, well done. I'm a fan of the drawing experience. Now is going to be the test though, the real test. There's a few things we're going to think about. Number one, how does the paint stand up when we really paint with it? Number two, how does the paint move around? Number three, how does this paper stand up to loads of water? So I've started off with a really watery wash using this big brush. Now this big brush is probably a bit too flexible for me, is what I'm finding. I'm not really able to fully control the shapes like I want to. It is producing a really nice soft effect, but it isn't quite allowing me to just push things in exactly the way I want. That comes down to personal preference. So I'm not going to call that a bad thing about this this set of brushes. Actually, I'm very pleasantly surprised with the painting experience from them. But I am going to say that brush that I was using just then, a little bit too soft for me. During this painting, I want to do some mixing. So I just mixed some of our lovely purples with the sort of fallow greens, because I want to see, do you get lovely, still crisp and clear colours when you mix these together? And I would say you do. So the reason that's important is because when you have these cheaper pigments, often we talked about them being hues. So often each individual colour might already be made up of 2 or 3 different pigments. When you then mix 2 or 3 colours together, you can end up with 4, 5 or 6 pigments, which can get very confusing and very muddy. But these colours, I'm not doing big mixes, I'm just mixing 2, occasionally 3 things together. But you know, actually they're looking quite clear. And although our transparency tests showed that they are not super transparent, the line work in my sketch is still glowing through, and that's the most important thing to me, is that the line work still comes through and still sort of sticks out. You can also see that we're getting lovely bleeding effects, we're getting movement of the water and the pigment around the page, the brush is able to splash. So the sketching experience, the painting experience from these is pretty alright for me. It's pretty alright. Here just trying a little bit of something else, trying the black pigment. Interestingly, the black's still not super granulating, although PBK11 is normally quite a granulating pigment, I believe. And I'm sure someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I believe it's still quite granulating, whereas perhaps there is something about how these pigments are bound or how they've been processed that means that all these colours are quite flat in terms of their texture. Not flat in terms of their movement and ability to interact with water, but flat in terms of their texture. Still though, you can see really bright and bold colours. I'm able to mix on the page, I'm able to push things around, and I'm able to end up with a really bright and lovely image. And this is my sort of first few steps of my sketch almost done. And what we're going to do now is just let it dry, and ta-da, like magic, you can see, just have a quick look now, you can see it didn't really fade much. So these colours really do maintain their boldness. They do have a slightly sort of white appearance. So there is a slight appearance that the lines covered by paint have got something on top of them. And you can see that really clearly when I come back over my lines. You can see how much bolder and black my lines are as I come back. So there is a degree of opacity here, which isn't my favourite thing. I love watercolours for their translucency. And what's happened here, I think, and I don't know this, but my impression and from my experience of other watercolours is that they've used a lot of brighteners or a lot of white in these pigments to make them so bold and make them so bright and vivid, but that does make them opaque. So it's just something to be aware of, and perhaps if you are layering your watercolours more than I do, that might be even more of a drawback. But if you like a single layer and bright and bold and quick sketching, well, it might be a worthwhile thing to balance off. And there you go, that is my sketch done, and actually it looks rather fun. It's not a bad sketch, I think. Thanks for watching all the way through that. I've got to say, I was very surprised how this final sketch came out. From the swatches, I thought the colours were bright and bold, and from the test for transparency, I was a little suspicious they were a bit too opaque and just sketching with them wouldn't work. But you know what, despite the lack of granulation, despite the lack of huge amounts of texture, they're very bright, they're very mobile colours. They won't last super long because you need to use a lot of pigment on your page, but if I was just starting out and I got this set, I wouldn't be disappointed. It would certainly be a good place to start. So if this is something that you can afford and you can't look to get something more local, then I wouldn't stop you getting this. This is a reasonable option, I think, for how to start, and you will be able to produce great art with it, which is perhaps the most important thing here, that you can stay happy, creative and have fun. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.